All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I have a goal. I don't even know if I'm going to make it. I don't even know why I should even set the goal, but we'll see if we can't get through the first commandment this week. Um, there's 10 commandments, but I have 10 lessons. I know I'll double some up. Um, so let's continue on from where we left off last week, and I had a few more points I wanted to make. We were discussing last week, do the 10 commandments apply to me? And, do I have to obey the Ten Commandments as they're set forth in the Old Testament? And, we're finding that, obviously we do. We do obey the Ten Commandments, but they're changed, they're transformed in the New Testament. And that's kind of what we were getting at. And we had discussed Christ fulfilling the law, and how did Christ fulfill the law? He obeyed it. He was manifestation as the promised Messiah. And then one of the key things, he was able to expand the law's teachings, to enlarge and expound on it, and add to the teachings of the law. And that was kind of what the focus of, one of the main focuses of our lessons are going to be, is how Christ transformed the Old Testament and the Ten Commandments. So if we go, I had another question here on question number 8, and I'll go through. I don't know if you still have that sheet. I don't think there's any back there, but I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. And in fact, this question here we just kind of was discussed not too long ago. But if we look at 2 Corinthians 3, and I'm going to even shorten it, and I think the sheet says 7 through 11. But 3:11 it says, "And what was transitory came with glory." Oh, I know what I did. I messed up. Okay, 1 Corinthians 3, 7 through 11 says, "Now if the ministry that brought death, which was engraved in letters on stone, came with glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily on the face of Moses because of its glory, transitory though it was, will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious?" So the question asks, Paul indicates he refers to the ministry of death. And what's meant by the ministry of death?
The wages of sin.
Okay. The wages of sin is death. Does someone have, is this the one I was, no, that's another one. What else? Yeah, the law could not deal with sin properly. An interesting thing to look at too, look at Exodus if you haven't read that right up there. There's Exodus 32, 25 through 28. So when Moses came down off the mountain, he had the tablets, the 2 tablets, and we discussed what was going on with the people. Remember, they got impatient, and what had they done? Right off the bat, they had built a golden calf, and they were worshiping idols. And it's interesting, Moses did something pretty drastic. Even after he just acted on behalf of the Israelites towards God, because God was going to destroy the people. And he's like, no, don't destroy them. But yeah, look what Moses does. Now, there was 600,000 of them, just men. We talked about that number a little bit. But look at verse 27. He had gone and he said, "As anyone follows me, come with me." And basically all the Levites came to him. And then he said to them, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. Each man strap a sword to his side, go back and forth through the camp from one end to the other, each killing his brother and friend and neighbor." The Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 300 people died. And that's a little part of the Ten Commandments story that we kind of, I wouldn't say forget about, but I've never really focused on that. But then if you think about it being the ministry of death, it kind of can, definitely has some resemblance or some semblance to how it started at the very beginning. And so that was kind of interesting. Yeah, the Old Covenant could not deal adequately with sin, which ultimately resulted in death. And if we look at 2 Corinthians here, we know we're now in the New Testament, we're in the New Covenant, and Paul's saying, yeah, if you really now at this point in time, if you still want to be living under the law, then yeah, you're living the ministry of death at this point. And it's kind of the opposite of Christ. Christ's and the plan of salvation is all based on a living hope. It's written on our hearts. We receive the Holy Spirit. There's the whole idea and concept of life in the New Testament's covenant, which is drastically different than the Old Testament covenant. Any comments on that before we move on? Okay, in this same group of scriptures here, I believe, this is where I messed up. Yeah, in 2 Corinthians 3:11, if we read that, how does Paul describe the Old Testament? What's one of the key words in that verse 11 that he's describing about the Old Testament? What's that? Passing away, okay. Or this, I use the NIV, it says transitory. Okay, it's not permanent. Okay, the Old Testament was not designed to be permanent. And if we look at Hebrews 8:13, and this is an interesting point too, the Romans destroyed the temple and Jerusalem around 70 AD. This Hebrew writing here is before that, roughly 65 AD. So you have 5-7 years, somewhere around here, that Paul comes out, and so the writer of Hebrews says this: by calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. And so shortly after that, we have the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of the temple. There's no longer, temple services ceased. There was no more, all that stuff was destroyed by the Romans. And so it's almost, I would almost say it's a prophetic statement by Paul or whoever the writer of Hebrews here we're referring to, that it'll all soon disappear, very soon, actually. So it was transitory. It was not meant to be forever. This microphone annoys me. Okay, question number 10 says, what has Christ done with the Old Testament which served to divide Jew from Gentile? So if we think about the hatred that was there, the Jews' hatred towards the Gentiles, and how did Christ deal with that? What does the coming of the Old Testament, or getting rid of the Old Testament, do? So let's look at Ephesians 2, and if we look at 14 through 18, I have it split up here in two different sections. But it says, for he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which way he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away, and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have access to the Father by the Spirit. So what did Christ do with the Old Testament that stopped the separation between Jew and Gentile? And if we look at verse 15, it says he set it aside. He just basically put it aside because it divided him. We know the Old Testament we talked about. Who was the Old Testament and the Old Covenant specifically designed for? Just the Jews, just the Israelites, right? The Gentiles had nothing to do with it. They weren't included in it. And the Israelites obviously thought they were God's chosen people and they had that special right. And all of a sudden they're saying, wait, the Gentiles are part of this? So there was that hatred there. But God's saying, no, I set all that aside. That Old Testament, that old covenant is set aside so that we can all live in peace. So God has set aside the Old Testament. One body reconciled through the cross. And we kind of just talked about this. Who was considered under the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament? Who was considered God's people? The Israelites, right? No one else, just the Israelites. There's no one really in the Old Testament that was God's people other than the Israelites. Who are considered God's people today? Christians? In verse 19 through 22, it says, "Consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people, and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him you two are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit." So yeah, his people now are Christians. Those that are, those who would be saved. Those that have gone through the New Testament plan of salvation. And even more so, the church, right? We here are God's people. Okay, no longer pertains to just the Israelites. Any comments on that? Okay, we've talked a lot about the priesthood. We talked about a new priest would come along, the order of Melchizedek. And let's look at Hebrews 7:11 through 13. And if we look at this new priesthood of Christ, the question is, how does that prove that the law has been changed? So Hebrews 7:11 through 13, it says, "If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, and indeed the law given to the people established that priesthood, why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron? For when the priesthood is changed, the law must be changed also. He of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe, and no one from the tribe has ever served at the altar." So, if the priesthood is changed, logic would say the law is going to change too, right? Does that make sense? I mean, the priesthood was the simple, it was the actual, I don't want to say the entity, but it was through their ceremonial law, the priestly law, that they were able to rectify violations of the moral commandments, I guess if you want to put it that way. So it would make no sense to just get rid of, they're not talking about, well, let's just get rid of the priestly laws. Let's just get rid of all this sacrifice we're doing and the ceremonial stuff we're doing in the temple, but we need to keep all the other stuff. Okay? We talked last week about how when Paul refers to his writings for most of the stuff that I'll be looking at, when he refers to the law, he's referring to the total package. Okay, so we can see that through the change of the priesthood, it was logic that the law would have to change also. And then this kind of sums up this idea of do the Ten Commandments apply to us? Let's look at Colossians 2:14. "Having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness which stood against us and condemned us, he has taken it away, nailing it to the cross." Now, does someone else have a different version of this scripture? What does something say besides charge of our legal indebtedness?
Certificate of debt.
Okay, certificate of debt. Anyone have old school King James version? Judy?
Something different. It says, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements.
Yeah, okay, the handwriting of requirements. In the King James version, I think says handwriting of ordinances. Okay, and that ties more easy. You hear the handwriting of ordinances, it's referring to the law. It's referring to the Old Testament law. It's referring to the Ten Commandments. And you have the handwriting of ordinances. Some of that was written by the finger of God, right? And some of it was written by the finger of Moses. So it's clearly referring to the law here in general, and he has taken it away and he's nailed it to the cross. He's done away with it. But it's still something that we obey, but we're not held to the law. So the bottom line is Christ did away with that and nailed it to the cross. And when he did that, it's transformed. Okay, and we all have common sense in here. It'd be idiotic to say, oh, we can murder, we can lie, we can do all this stuff now. It's obviously not. I could see getting into some argument of some non-Christian person in the work environment and like, what? God did away with the Ten Commandments? Oh, so you're saying we can murder? Obviously, we're far from going. That's not where we're going. Jessica. Yeah, and then we'll see how the new laws that Jesus has established, kind of, a lot of them are just expounding on and adding to a higher degree of element to the ones that were in the Old Testament. And he's able to now, in the New Testament, the laws are written where? In the New Testament, on our hearts, right? So you have that spiritual effect now. There's something more meaningful than a bunch of rules. Oh, what was the law in Leviticus that says we have to do such and such on Thursdays? Oh, I can't remember. It's not a bunch of stuff written on paper. I mean, it is. It's in God's Word, but it's written on our hearts. Okay, there's a spirituality of it. There's a living part of it. We just talked about how the Old Testament was the covenant of death, and so Christ comes and transposes all that and puts it on our hearts in a different aspect.
It's been said, like in other, I don't know, by some other Bible class teacher a long time ago, that the Ten Commandments are kind of like these rules, but Jesus elevates it to principle. That,
Okay, yeah.
You shall not murder. Well, Jesus says, well, do not hate.
Yeah.
So you like, the rules are kind of almost like a baseline, and Jesus brings it
Yeah.
to another level.
And he'll expand on it too, as we'll get at. In fact, the next couple lessons we're going to get into it of instead of doing this because we have to obey the rules, why are we doing these things now? Because we love Jesus. We're doing it out of love for the Father and for the love of Jesus and God. And that's what the New Testament has done with these Ten Commandments. Okay, so that being said, let's move on to the first commandment. And I don't know why this bugs me. I should have just changed this. I cheated and I just grabbed this off the internet. You must not have any other God but me. You shall have no other gods before me. I don't know. But Exodus 20:2-3, it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So here we are introduced to the first commandment. And what we'll do as we go through this lesson and we come to the end, I have Mark 12:29-30 here. You can read it. I'm going to move on because I'm going to cover this again at the end of the lesson. But we'll see how we transition from this Old Testament law given to the Israelites that you shall have no other gods before me to what Christ is referring to now, how he's expounding on this when we get up into Mark, the 12th chapter. But we talked last week about the need for the Ten Commandments and that we had a nation that was emerging. We had a covenant relationship with the Israelites and God, and there needed to be some laws and some rules set forth. And as we go further and you get up into Exodus 21, 22, and you get into the tabernacle and those types of things, that needed to be established. And the very first commandment that God gives them is, you shall have no other gods before me. And so God wanted their exclusive worship. Now think about where the Israelites had been for the last, 400 years? And what type of, did the Egyptians worship the God that created the earth that we read about in Genesis? No, they were very polytheistic. They had multiple gods. And so the Israelites had to have been accustomed to that. That was kind of the rule of the land around them. And as they, God knew as they went into Canaan that they would also encounter that all these people are going to have these different types of gods. And God knew that would be an issue for them. So it's kind of interesting, the very first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. No, okay, I'll pose this as a question. Are there other gods? Yeah, okay, there are no other capital G-O-D-S's, right? There's only one capital G-O-D-S. No, G-O-D, sorry, take that off. There's only one capital G-O-D, all right? And on my notes here, I have a little note, discuss lowercase G-O-D-S versus upper capital G-O-D, okay? Now, I mean, we can think about the gods of, the polytheistic gods of the Old Testament, and Zeus, Hermes, which we'll talk about later, Molech, there was a bunch, I can't name them all, but you go back to Greek anthology and whatnot, we know that they had gods that were in charge of a specific thing, okay? We were just blessed by the God of rain a couple days ago, okay? Or the God of harvest or whatever. Whatever they needed, they prayed to that God, okay? Whereas the one God we have, He's a God of love. He's the God of everything. And so there's that idea of gods. And we're going to talk more, this first commandment and the second commandment intertwine a lot. And so I'm going to bring up some points next week about what are gods. And we'll talk about this too today. But, a God is also something that receives our worship. And if we look at it that way in general terms, there's a lot of stuff that sort of receives our worship. Look at Isaiah. I like what Isaiah has to say here. The gods are made by human hands. Isaiah 37:19 says, they have thrown their gods into the fire and destroyed them, for they were not gods, but only wood and stone fashioned by human hands. Now, there's probably more reference to idols that they're throwing in the fire, but the idea is they're only so-called gods, okay? There's no real ontological existence as our one true God has. And we'll talk more about that, and even next week too, but God wanted He wanted their exclusive worship. Whatever got them sidetracked or whatnot, no, don't do that. Don't get caught up in these other gods. Worship me exclusively. And so that's kind of the reasoning that we see behind this first commandment. And now we can let's get to our study sheet here. And question number 1 says, upon what great blessing did God base His claim to Israel's exclusive and eternal praise as the 10 Commandments began to be given? And then verse 2 of Exodus 20, we just read it, but it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So how does this one God think He deserves all of the Israelites' worship? What has He done for them? Right. He's brought them up out of Egypt where they were slaves. And He's also kind of, I want to say an introductory thing, because He said, I am the Lord your God, brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, and have no gods before me. So He's establishing, hey, remember what I've done for you guys. Just a second, Jessica. He's reminding them of the miracles that happened, the plagues that happened. They had already just crossed the Red Sea. And I found this interesting. This is another thing that I kind of didn't really, I pick up as I study this more in depth, and I should have known it. But if you look, okay, at the first miracle when Aaron and Moses come to the Pharaoh and say, hey, we want you to free the people, and they perform some kind of miracle. And what does Aaron do? He takes his staff and he throws it down on the ground, and it turns to a snake, right? Okay, amazing. Okay, well, Pharaoh says, where are my magicians? Can you guys do that? Oh, yeah. And what do? What do Pharaoh's magicians do? They make snakes too, right? But what does Aaron's snake do? Aaron's snake eats them all up. So, That's in the movie too, by the way. Okay. You know what's funny? I was back there making copies, and I was looking, and I saw that movie up there. I was like, oh, I should just put that in, and we'll just discuss it. But yeah, so the Aaron's staff eats the other snakes. God's more powerful, right? But then if you look at the first two commandments, or not the first two commandments, the first two plagues, the water to blood and the frogs, Pharaoh's magicians were able to do that too. Now, the scriptures say, if you go back and look at it, it specifically says that God and Moses in his miracle, they turned all the water to blood. They didn't even have anything to drink. And then it has a little sentence there that Pharaoh's magicians were able to do it also. Now, me in my mind, I'm picturing, hey, let's turn the river to blood, which is what God does, and then the magician's sitting there with a cup of water, and it's like, oh, no, just focus. Look, I made it red like blood. Okay, at a much smaller scale. That's just in my mind how I'm picturing it. But if you look at the first two plagues, Pharaoh's men were able to duplicate it. But then you get to the third plague of the gnats, and they couldn't do it. For some reason, they couldn't do the gnat plague. And they told Pharaoh, like, hey, something's going on. This is divine. These guys are doing this by a divine power. Their God is doing this. And then after that, you don't hear anything about Pharaoh's men on the next 7 trying to complete the plagues. But it proves there that God is all powerful, right? And Satan's powerful too, right? In our lives, we've got to think, is Satan not powerful? He is powerful. And Pharaoh's magicians were pretty powerful, okay? But they were no match for God. So I think that's kind of a personal point we can bring up and apply it to our lives. But God is saying, hey, there's a reason he does all this stuff. I'm way more powerful than Pharaoh and Pharaoh's magicians, and I am worthy of your worship. And I'm sorry, Jessica, is your...
In the way that God titles himself, he says, I'm the Lord your God. It's saying Yahweh, which is I am, and then God, basically the creator. I am your creator. So basically, not only establishing that he is their God, but he's also the creator of everything. So that's basically saying, I have full authority.
True, yes. And again, it's establishing the awesome power and the that he is worthy of worship for sure. Question number 2 on the sheet there. It says, describe the conditions of the Israelites prior to this blessing. And I have Exodus 1, 8 through 16, and then chapter 3, verse 7. It's a little bit long reading. I'll go through it real quick. Well, we had talked about, I think Randy brought up that, they had Joseph, when Joseph was there, everything was good. Then we had a new power in Egypt that didn't know Joseph, and all of a sudden things got bad for the Egyptians. And the king looked and said, wow, look at the number of these people. We've got to do something about it. They're going to fight against us in a war. We better be careful. So you look at verse 11, it says, so they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor and brick and mortar, with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if he is a girl, let her live. And then I want to include Exodus 3:7. It says, "The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering." So what was the condition of the Israelites? Were things good? No. They're slaves, right? Was it good times slaves? Was it was harsh, right? It was severe, harsh slavery. And then the Egyptians started to fear them, thinking that there was too many of them, so they were looking at killing the baby boys, and they were crying out and suffering. And who heard them? God. God heard them crying out and suffering. And another little application to our lives is, picture our lives before the blessing of salvation, before Christ came and died on the cross and set us free from sin. And I'm sure some stories are more dramatic. I mean, I don't know everyone's background in here. I know a lot of us were probably raised in the church and we studied with our parents and we were baptized. But then there's those that weren't always Christians, that always didn't lead the Christian life. And, working in the prison, I saw that all the time. And we'd kind of give the guys a hard time, like, "Oh, yeah, now you found Jesus, huh?" And some of them were legit, and some of them were just using it to manipulate. I would always tell them, I was like, "Hey, Jesus knows your heart." Because there were those guys that were just manipulating to go get out earlier, go do something. But I think of that extreme when you look at where our lives were before the blessing of Jesus. But you know what? It was just as messed up for me too, because my life was really messed up before salvation, because I was lost in sin. Okay? I wasn't saved from sin before. So if you look at it that way too, when Jesus came, died on the cross, and we were baptized in Jesus' name, that salvation, that freedom from sin, what a wonderful blessing. And so, that was the blessing that God gave the Israelites. He set them free from Egyptians into slavery. Okay, number 3, it says, describe the impression that the Red Sea crossing must have created in the minds of the Hebrews. And just a couple points I want to make on that, because we talked about that already. But look at, I think around verse 10. Yeah, so we have the Pharaoh decided to go after him. He's got all of his, almost his whole army going after him, and they catch up to him, and the Egyptians see them coming, and right there in verse 10 it says they were terrified and cried out to the Lord. Okay, so right off the bat, they're terrified. Okay, and then what do they do next? They grumbled to Moses. So we're going to find out they were really good at grumbling to Moses. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert, Moses. So they're whining to Moses. Okay, so you have fear followed by grumbling and doubt. But then look what Moses tells them. Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance of the Lord that he will bring to you today. And then if we jump all the way up to verse 31 in this story, now they've crossed the Red Sea and they've seen the sea close in on all of Pharaoh's men. And now what do they say? And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and Moses, his servant. So we see this idea of terror followed by doubt, with the promise of deliverance. And is the deliverance delivered? Does God deliver on what he says? He does. God will deliver. So God saves them and rescues them because he can do the impossible. So that's another little point that we can take for ourselves. But question 4. What step did God command to help Israel avoid putting other gods ahead of him? In Exodus 34:12 through 15, it says, be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going, or they will be a snare among you. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down their Asherah poles, but do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous a jealous God. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land, For when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to them, they will invite you, and you will eat their sacrifices. And when you choose some of their daughters as wives for your sons, and those daughters prostitute themselves to their gods, they will lead your sons to do the same. So what word of advice does God have for them? What command does he tell them to help them avoid worshiping other gods? Okay, don't intermarry, right? Just stay away from them. And what's the first thing he said in there about the treaty? Right? Don't make a treaty with them. Do not enter in treaties with them. Break down their altars. Basically, don't be corrupted by the people of the land, right? Is that applicable to us today? Are we easily corrupted by the people of the land? We want to say, are we easily corrupted by the world? Get caught up into worldly things. And as we'll see, I'm jumping ahead of myself, but that idea, can some of these worldly things be considered gods? Little g? And that's kind of where we'll get into here in lesson 2, or in the second commandment. You can't help but think of 2 Corinthians 6:14, where it talks about being yoked. It says, do not be yoked together with unbelievers, for what do righteousness and wickedness have in common, or what fellowship can light have with darkness? Okay, so he's telling them there, don't associate with this. Okay, question 5. How do the scriptures describe the following gods of Canaan? And so it's broken down into the god of lowercase g, of Molech, and then Ashtoreth. And in Molech, we read about him, there's a couple verses in the Old Testament, particularly Leviticus 18:21. It says, do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. And then Jeremiah 32:35, it says, they built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters to Molech. Though I never commanded, nor did it enter my mind, that they should do such a detestable thing and so make Judah sin. So what was one interesting thing about the god Molech that was a prominent god in the land of Canaan? What did that god want? Yeah, human or children sacrifice, right? And if we read on in Jeremiah, the Israelites were right up there doing it. They even built an altar up in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters. They got caught up right in the middle of it. And it was very detestable to God. And then the other god is Ashtoreth. And Judges 10:6 and 1 Samuel 7:3-4. You can read that real quick if you want to. But that talks a little bit about that god. And the interesting thing about with Ashtaroth is generally, and with a lot of these other gods, they were oppressed into slavery and ended up worshiping the gods of the lands. But this was this god, worship to her included sexual immorality, prostitution, fortune-telling, witchery, witchcraft, and you've heard of the Asherah poles. That if you saw those around, then that meant that the people of that area worshiped this particular god. So we can see some of the gods that that they dealt with as they got into Canaan, and we can see that they weren't able to obey the first commandment. And then we see another story of another god, lowercase g, in 1 Kings 18:19-39. I think you're all pretty familiar with this. I just took instead of going through 19-39, I took the gist of it is right there in verse 22-24. It says, then Elijah said to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire is God. Okay, and then if you go through the whole story, the prophets of Baal are dancing around all the way from morning to noon, and they can't seem to get their God to light this fire. Elijah's actually kind of starting to poke a little fun at him, and he's like, "Oh, let me go get my fire going." And what's he do? Well, he goes and pours a bunch of water on it, right? I think it's like, says like 4 things of water 3 times, something like that. But it's soaked. How in the world are you going to get this lit? And then he calls upon his God to do, and poof, God, brings fire and lights it up. And so again, you can see some of the gods of the Old Testament and how our God was far superior. I might be able to pull this. No, I don't know. Question 7. What other gods did Paul and Barnabas encounter? Let's look at Acts 14, 8 through 13. An interesting story here, and I'll just kind of paraphrase this, but Paul and Barnabas were traveling to Lystra, and when they came into the city, they found a man that couldn't walk, hadn't walked since birth, so they performed a miracle and healed him. And all the people around there saw what they had done. And verse 11 says, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." And they thought Barnabas was Zeus, and they thought Paul was Hermes. And so, what other gods? So these are the Greek pagan gods of Zeus and Hermes that right off the bat they're dealing as they come into Lystra. And the next part of it says, how did they handle the problem? And if we go on to Acts in the 14 through 18, what do Paul and Barnabas do? It says, but when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friend, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them." So how do they handle the situation? They've got all these people gathered around him like, it's Zeus in human form. Look at the miracle they performed. And these people are wanting to worship them. And what do?
Wasn't there a statue to an unknown God?
Yeah, we're going to get there. Yep. Okay, what if you had a bunch of people coming up and wanting to worship you? Like, oh, amazing. Oh, you're just amazing. What can we do for you? Like, oh, okay, wow. Obviously not Paul and Barnabas. Okay, they tore their clothes off. No, we're only human. We're only human. But then what's the interesting thing that they did? What did they tell the people around there? Yeah, they preached the gospel. They're going into the middle of Greek pagan gods, and these people think they're Zeus and Hermes. And they're like, no, we're only human, but let me tell you about the real God. And they preach the gospel right in the middle of paganistic, where there was a lot of Greek culture in Lystra there. And then we see Paul goes into Athens, and his first trip to Athens, and he's right off the bat as he gets into Athens, he's kind of appalled by all the gods that it appears that they're worshiping, all the how polytheistic they are. And if we read 17, 16 through 18, let's see, what was Paul accused of when he's preaching in Athens? And so it says, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So when Paul goes into Athens and he starts talking to the scholars in there, what do they accuse him of? Yeah, as advocating for foreign gods. But Paul was bold. Paul's like right in there preaching the gospel to these guys. And then this one is where, if you go into verse 19 and 31, this is what Nolan was just talking about. It says, which was the only God the Athenians worshipped, who was not really one of the other gods God condemned. And if you go down into I think it's here in 22 and 23. Paul then stood up at the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you." Okay, you gotta love Paul, man. He's so bold. He's going right into there into Athens and whatnot, and telling these people, he says, "You guys are idiots." But actually, if you think about it, they're kind of, I'm sure this is what they thought. They thought they were genius because they're like, "Oh, we've got all these statues to all these gods, but what if we missed one? Oh, that one would be so upset with us. Let's just create a god of the unknown God so we can cover ourselves." Good thinking. Say, that's smart, right? And Paul catches on to that and says, "Well, okay, you do have this guy here, and this is the God that I'm preaching about." Okay, was their worship to this God satisfactory? No, not at all. No. It wasn't sufficient worship just to have a statue there. So Paul tells them, you guys are completely naive to proper worship. So Paul goes on to teach them the one true living God worthy of worship. And that'll do pretty good, because the next 2 points are kind of, I want to hit kind of hard because it's kind of the key thing here. So we can do that, and next week we'll do question 9 and 10. So if you want to bring your study sheets back, and then we'll go into the second commandment about the graven images, and that'll all tie together. But I think that's a good place to stop. Judy? Yeah, the boldness of it, and that's. I think the next question number 9 will lead to some good discussion. It would flow right now, but I want to spend a little bit of time on it, so we'll come back to that next week. So, thank you all for listening and giving me your attention. I appreciate it, and you're dismissed.